Welcome into press coverage. Dan Hope joined by Andy Anders to talk a little bit of Ohio State men's basketball, which received some bad news on Wednesday as it was announced that Taison Chatman, a key backup guard going into the 2024 season, is going to be sidelined for the entire year after suffering a knee injury in summer workouts. And Andy, this is a big blow to Ohio State's backcourt depth because Ohio State brought in Michi Johnson. He's going to fill that starting role alongside Bruce Thornton. But you look at the rest of the roster, really the only other true guard they have is Junie Mobley. And so this is certainly a tough hit for Ohio State going into Jake Diebler's first season, that it will be without Taison Chatman for the entire year.
Yeah, a wicked blow to suffer 5 months before the season even begins here. That schedule gets underway in November. Ohio State's really just in summer workouts, getting themselves physically prepared, not even in that like true camp portion of season preparations, and this is a big piece you've lost for this entire season. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about him coming back. He is out for the year, at least per Ohio State's release. It sounds like a torn ACL in his left knee, and that left knee is also what gave him some injury difficulties at the beginning of last season. Didn't play in the first handful of games for Ohio State due to that, and that kind of slowed his development too, because it took out valuable practice time, scrimmage time, those sorts of things when you're getting acclimated as a freshman. And look, this is a guy who was the top rated prospect from a class that ranked number 7 in the country for Ohio State, right? Devin Royal and Scotty Middleton, what they did in their freshman years. Of course, Scotty's now out of the program. You look at that, and Taison was even higher rated than those guys. Came in as a combo guard, meaning he could factor in at either the 1 or the 2, and really was expected to take a big leap this year. And even talking to people behind the scenes today after this news broke, they were expecting a big leap out of Taison. And it's why they didn't take an additional guard with Michi Johnson in the portal, I think, in a lot of ways, is that they were confident in the pieces they had with Taison, with Junie Mobley coming in, who will now he's the next guy up. And I don't think you want to put that much weight on a freshman. But Taison, even though he only played 4 minutes last year, was making some strides toward the end of the season, playing a little bit more under Jake Diebler at the end. And losing him is unquestionably a blow, because there were significant plans for him in this rotation this year.
Now, Ohio State does still have one scholarship available, so it could feasibly use that scholarship to bring in another guard to help replace Taison Chatman on this year's roster. But it sounds like at least the plan before this injury for Ohio State has been to bring in more front court depth. Andy, by your understanding, do you think Ohio State could pivot to bringing in a guard here, or are they going to stick with the original plan and add some more depth in the front court?
It was clearly the plan coming in before this injury to add more front court depth with that final roster spot. And to me, obviously, and to I'm sure a lot of people listening, pivoting to a guard would make logical sense. But the complications that can arise in that, and I'm not purporting to know anything specifically here on or off the record about what's going on behind closed doors in terms of adding that last spot for Ohio State. But, this was an absolute curveball, right? You don't know if they were talking to somebody and maybe they are like finalizing the details even, or at least kind of have a silent commitment from somebody. If there's clearly was a plan to fill that last spot, but I am not sure how far along that plan was to being enacted. And depending on how far along that plan is or was before this injury, that might complicate it being just so easy as, hey, let's pivot. Let's go get a guard now, because clearly we need the depth if you're Jake Diebler in Ohio State. And so I know that's like kind of dancing around things a little bit, but this is a confusing time. You don't expect a guy to get a season-ending injury in the middle of the summer, and it just goes to show how much of a wrench, how much of a curveball it can throw into these things. And we'll see what Ohio State ultimately does do with that last scholarship spot. whether it's still going to focus on another front court piece to get some more depth there, whether it's going to try and get a guard with maybe some experience a little bit to provide depth where they need it in the backcourt. So that's all up in the air, I think, and we'll try to get a better grasp on exactly what the plan is there kind of in the coming days, I'm sure.
Well, the reality is too that, a few years ago, like if an injury happened during summer workouts, like this wasn't an option to just, you just go to the transfer portal and get another guy. Like, this is kind of a new thing in college basketball. And like realistically, Ohio State probably would have liked to have filled that spot by now. And then this really wouldn't even be a conversation. There's not a whole, if you look at, who's available right now in the transfer portal with it being mid-June, there's not really a whole lot of guys left. It's kind of like when we talk about the football team and they were trying to plug a hole on their offensive line in the post-spring transfer portal. It's been far enough removed from the end of a transfer portal deadline now that there's not a whole lot of guys out there that can come in and be a plug-and-play guy in that backcourt this year. And so, that's the challenge, but that's why when we were initially talking about transfer portal strategy for Jake Diebler in his first off season as Ohio State coach, both of us initially expected they would bring in another guard. And this is exactly the reason why, because, if you're going in with only 4 true guards, you're living dangerously there. One injury, and now your depth can be pretty precarious. Now, we know that Bruce and Michi are both going to play a lot of minutes. It sounds like Jake Diebler is very high on Junie Mobley, and he's a guy who's a very highly regarded recruit. So Junie Mobley is certainly a guy who's going to come in with expectations of playing quite a bit right away. And so I think you could certainly be in a worse situation than him being that first guard off the bench. I think the big question now becomes is, okay, if somebody else gets hurt, like now what do we do? Micah Parrish is a guy who does have some, ball handling experience. Evan Mahaffey does as well. So those are probably the next 2 guys you look at as kind of that emergency point guard in a situation where you might need one. But, we had just talked recently about, the need for, more shooters to emerge too for this Ohio State team. Taison was certainly one of the guys you looked at as a potential spark in that outside shooting area. So, to lose him here, it's not going to change your starting lineup, but I do think it is a significant hit for Ohio State, both in terms of that backcourt depth and in terms of your shooting.
Yeah, when you look down the list to your point of, who's available in the portal, there really aren't any names at the top of the transfer portal list this far removed from the spring window that are obvious like targets for Ohio State. I'm sure, maybe you could go digging and find some, and there's guys out there that remain that don't have a destination for next year, but it's hard to add that piece this late in the process. And even if Ohio State feels like they need it, are you going to be able to get a guy who can actually contribute at a Big Ten level? So those are, like you said, the comparison with what happened with the offensive line and considerations of whether to add there in the spring was pretty apt. You mentioned Micah and Evan, and I think that's going to be important. It was already an important part of the plan, especially, I think, with Micah and the things that he can do versatility-wise on the offensive end, has a better shooting touch than Evan does, did plenty of ball handling and passing at San Diego State off of the wing. But when you talk about true guards, to only have 3 is a very precarious spot. And so they're going to have to build enough depth somehow with Evan and Micah. Maybe that's more of an offseason focus that would have been previously, to have them ready if, hey, you've got to slide down to a backcourt role. If one of these guys goes down, you can't have Bruce and Michi never coming off the court, or whoever, if someone goes down, whether it's Bruce and Junior, whatever the combination is, you can't expect guys to play 40 consecutive minutes a game. And you'd like to have multiple guards to roll for that reason. Now you're guaranteed to only have one if you don't add anybody else, short of, again, maybe Micah gets some minutes at that spot anyway. But this is the situation you now find yourself in, and it's a pretty big early hurdle for Jake to clear in his first year as Ohio State's head coach.
Well, the other thing too, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I don't know if we're supposed to say Roddy Gale's name on here anymore, but it wasn't that long ago we were talking about the possibility of a Bruce Thornton, Michi, and Roddy Gale all being in the starting lineup. Having a free guard lineup. Now it feels like you have a very limited ability to even do that. And when you think about competing in March and some of the teams that you're going to play in that postseason, you want to have that versatility to be able to play small ball. And this is a roster that now feels like it's constructed that Ohio State almost has to play big, because it feels like you have more forwards who are going to be ready to play this year than you're going to have guards. So, it's going to be an interesting challenge to navigate for sure. For Jake Diebler in his first year as Ohio State's coach, we know that things are going to look a little different than they did under Chris Holtmann, and he's trying to build that roster in a way that will fit his system. But I do think this is something that throws a wrench into those plans a little bit, that he's going to have to be able to adapt
and overcome. And then they're certainly going to have to adapt with this, especially barring another, if they don't ultimately add another guard in the portal. It's just how exactly do the rotations work? That's going to be a major question entering this season, because it's going to have to be non-traditional to get players the rest they need, keep the legs as fresh as they want. Unless you're rolling those top three, I guess you could get Bruce and Michi probably enough rest just rolling Junie, but it's going to be difficult to sustain a lot of those minutes on a lot of those legs as the season progresses, I would imagine.
Well, we're going to have some more basketball coverage coming up on 11warriors.com. Part of a team's workout is going to be open to the media on Thursday. Bruce Thornton and Michi Johnson will be meeting with the media that day as well. So stay tuned with 11warriors.com and with 11 Warriors' YouTube page for coverage to come from that as Ohio State basketball continues summer workout. No Taison Chatman for 2024-25, but still a lot of interesting players to watch this upcoming season as Jake Diebler tries to turn things around from the disappointments of the end of a Chris Holtmann era. And so we will continue to cover all of those developments throughout the season, leading into the season in the fall. And we hope you guys will keep up with our coverage.